The message from the Concorde of 12 arrived on a Tuesday morning, Earth time. Director Maya Chun read it 3 times before setting down her tablet. The words were polite. The meaning was not. Humanity had 30 days to accept tributary status. This meant giving up control of their own technology. It meant paying taxes to species they had never met. It meant bowing to rulers who saw them as nothing more than another problem to be managed. Chun had spent 40 years in diplomacy. She had negotiated with corporations, governments, and once a very angry union of asteroid miners. But this was different. The Concorde had ruled their part of the galaxy for 6,000 years. They had absorbed hundreds of species. None had ever said no. She called a meeting with Earth's leadership. The conversation lasted 9 hours. When it was over, Chun recorded a single-word response and sent it back across the stars. No. The Concorde received the message with something close to confusion. The records showed no precedent for refusal. A junior administrator flagged it as a possible translation error. When confirmation came that the humans meant exactly what they said, the matter was escalated to the military council. The council spent very little time on their decision. A subjugation fleet was dispatched to the human colony of Karath Prime. 200 warships, 50,000 soldiers. Enough force to crush a small empire. Karath Prime was not an empire. It was a mining colony of 800,000 people, most of them workers and their families. The planet was rich in rare metals, but poor in everything else. Its military garrison numbered 400. When the Concorde fleet arrived, they expected immediate surrender. Instead, they received a broadcast from a man named Colonel James Okonkwo. He was 53 years old, born on Earth, and had served in the Colonial Defense Force for 30 years. His message was brief. This is Colonel Okonkwo of the Karath Prime Garrison. We have received your demand for surrender. We decline. We will hold this position until reinforced. End of message. The Concorde commander, a being called Thren, who had overseen 17 successful subjugations, assumed this was posturing. He ordered a demonstration strike. 3 mining facilities were reduced to ash from orbit. Then he repeated his demand. Okonkwo's second message was identical to his first. Thren ordered ground forces deployed. He expected the operation to last 2 days at most. His soldiers were professional, well-equipped, and experienced. The humans were miners with improvised weapons and a small garrison of troops who were clearly insane. The first assault on the main colony failed within hours. The humans had spent the time since the fleet's arrival digging. The mining equipment that had once extracted ore from Karath Prime's rocky surface now carved tunnels beneath the colony. The colonists vanished underground like water in the sand. Thren's soldiers found themselves fighting in darkness. The humans knew every tunnel, every shaft, every hidden passage. They struck and vanished. They collapsed ceilings on advancing troops. They turned mining charges into weapons. After a week, Thren had lost 300 soldiers. He had not captured a single tunnel complex. He ordered the tunnels flooded. The colonists dug deeper. He cut off the water supply. The colonists found underground streams. He collapsed the main tunnel networks with orbital strikes. The colonists dug new ones. Weeks became months. The Concorde's resources poured into Karath Prime like water into a hole that had no bottom. Thren requested reinforcements. He received them, along with pointed questions from the council about why this miner operation was taking so long. The humans should have broken. Every model the Concorde had, every historical precedent, said that populations under siege eventually surrendered. Starvation, disease, and hopelessness always won in the end. It was simply a matter of time, but the humans on Karath Prime did not break. Colonel Okonkwo broadcast regular updates to anyone who would listen. His voice became famous across the colony worlds. He spoke of rationing, of casualties, of children learning to live in darkness. He also spoke of small victories. A successful ambush, a supply cache discovered, a baby born in the tunnels named Hope. "We are still here," he said at the end of each message. "We are still holding." By the 6th month, Thren had lost 4,000 soldiers. The cost of the siege had exceeded the value of Karth Prime's mineral deposits 10 times over. The council sent investigators to determine what was going wrong. The investigators interviewed captured humans. They studied human history. What they found disturbed them. Humans, it seemed, had a long relationship with hopeless causes. They had records of cities that held for years against impossible odds. They had stories of small groups fighting enemies that outnumbered them 100 to 1. They had a word for the refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the only logical choice. The word was defiance. On the 300th day of the siege, something changed. Sensors detected ships entering the system, not Concord ships. Human ships. Earth had spent 11 months building a rescue fleet. The ships were hastily constructed, undermanned, and outgunned by the Concord forces in every way. Military analysts gave them a 12% chance of reaching the planet. They came anyway. The Battle of Karth Prime lasted 6 hours. The human fleet lost half its ships in the first engagement. They did not retreat. They pushed forward through the Concord lines, taking losses that would have broken any sensible fleet. A transport ship named the Defiance reached the planet's surface. It carried supplies, weapons, and 2,000 fresh soldiers. Its captain, a woman named Sarah Okonkwo, the colonel's daughter, had volunteered for the mission, knowing she would not survive it. Her ship was destroyed on the return flight. The Concord won the battle. They destroyed most of the human fleet. But 3 more transports reached the surface. And the humans in the tunnels now had enough supplies to hold for another year. Thren looked at the projections. He looked at the cost reports. He looked at the faces of his commanders, who were tired and frustrated and beginning to ask questions he could not answer. On the 347th day, the Concord offered terms, not surrender. A treaty. The humans could keep Karth Prime. They would remain independent, confined to their small cluster of colonies, but free. Colonel Okonkwo accepted the terms. He emerged from the tunnels for the first time in almost a year, blinking in the sunlight. Beside him walked his granddaughter, 3 years old, who had never seen the sky. The Concord of 12 had ruled their part of the galaxy for 6,000 years. They had never failed to subjugate a species they targeted until now and across the galaxy. Other species began to whisper. They whispered about the humans who had said no, and what it might mean to say no themselves. The Treaty of Karth bought humanity 20 years. It was not a victory, and no one pretended it was. The Concord had simply decided that crushing humanity would cost more than ignoring them. The humans were confined to their small cluster of colonies. They were watched, they were monitored, and they were dismissed. This was a mistake. In the 2 decades that followed, humanity did what humanity has always done. They built. They learned. They remembered. The children of Karth Prime grew up on stories of the siege. They learned the names of the 400 soldiers who held the tunnels. They knew about Sarah Okonkwo, who flew through a fleet to bring supplies to her father. They understood, in a way that could not be taught, but only lived, that surrender was not an option. The military academies developed a new doctrine. They called it strategic perseverance. It was the formal study of outlasting enemies who held every conventional advantage. The curriculum included history, psychology, and engineering. Cadets learned about Stalingrad and Thermopylae. They studied how to build ships that could be repaired with minimal resources. They trained to keep fighting long after reasonable species would stop. Meanwhile, the diplomats worked quietly. They made contact with other species in the Concord's territory, Not the rulers, but the ruled. The tributary species who had accepted submission because they saw no alternative. The humans did not promise revolution. They simply listened. They shared their own story. And they waited. The hegemony of Keth was a rival power to the Concord, ruling a different sector of the galaxy. They had watched the siege of Karth Prime with interest. Where the Concord saw costly embarrassment, the Keth saw opportunity. The humans had proven difficult, yes. But surely that was because the Concord had been too gentle. The Keth would not make the same mistake. 20-2 years after first contact, Keth warships entered human space. The first battle took place near a colony called New Mumbai. The Keth brought a fleet of 300 ships, expecting to demonstrate their superiority quickly. The human defense force numbered 60 vessels. The battle lasted 3 days. When it ended, the Keth had lost 40 ships. The humans had lost all 60. But the Keth had not captured New Mumbai. The colony's defenses had held long enough for the population to evacuate. When Keth soldiers finally reached the surface, they found empty buildings and a message painted on the landing pad. We single quotes, "I'll be back." The Keth commanders dismissed this as bravado. Then the raids began. Human ships appeared at the edges of Keth supply lines. They struck fast, destroyed what they could, and vanished before heavy response arrived. They targeted fuel depots, communication relays, and transport ships. Individually, each attack was mire. Together, they were sand in the machinery of the Keth war effort. The humans also did something the Keth did not expect. They talked across the Keth territory. Broadcasts began appearing on frequencies that should have been secure. Human voices speaking in translation, telling the story of Karth Prime, telling the tributary species under Keth rule that resistance was possible. That saying no was an option. The Keth responded by sending a larger fleet. 2,000 ships, the largest armada assembled in a century. They would crush the humans utterly and make an example. That would silence the whispers spreading. Through their territory, the Battle of the Mira Corridor became a turning point in galactic history. The humans did not try to win. They knew they could not win, not against those numbers. Instead, they fought to survive. Their doctrine of strategic perseverance had prepared them for exactly this moment. Human ships were built with redundant systems. When one engine failed, another took over. When hull breaches opened, automated systems sealed them. The crews trained to keep fighting through damage that would cripple any other vessel. And when ships were destroyed, the crews ejected. Recovery teams, positioned behind the battle lines, collected survivors. Within days, those same crews were in new ships, returning to the fight. The Keth won every engagement. They destroyed human stations that were rebuilt within months. They achieved tactical victory after tactical victory. And yet, somehow, the humans were still there. Different ships, same crews, same determination. After the first year, the Keth War Council commissioned a study. They wanted to know how long the humans could sustain this level of resistance. The answer came back: 40 years. 40 years of raids and rebuilding. 40 years of battles that the Keth would win, but that would cost them resources they needed elsewhere. 40 years of broadcasts spreading sedition through their territory. 40 years of watching tributary species begin to ask uncomfortable questions. The Keth could not afford 40 years. Neither could the Concord. They had been watching from the sidelines, officially neutral but privately concerned. The doctrine of submission had maintained their power for 6,000 years. It rested on a simple assumption: resistance was futile. Every species the Concord had absorbed knew this to be true. They had accepted their place because fighting was pointless. But now there was a species that fought anyway. A species that lost and kept fighting. A species that refused to accept that surrender was inevitable. If humanity succeeded against the Keth, That assumption would shatter. Every tributary species in the Concord's territory would see that the rulers were not invincible. That saying no was possible. That the cost of submission might be higher than the cost of resistance. The Concord Council met in emergency session. For the first time in centuries, they debated a question that had no comfortable answer. What do you do with an enemy that cannot be beaten because they refuse to acknowledge defeat? 3 years into the war, the hegemony of Keth sent a diplomatic envoy to Earth. They offered peace. Not conquest, not tributary status. A simple end to hostilities. The humans accepted. But in the treaty negotiations, they made one thing clear. This was not over. This would never be over. Humanity would keep building, keep learning, keep reaching out to every species that had ever chafed under the rule of empires. The Keth negotiator asked what the humans wanted. The human ambassador smiled. We want the galaxy to know that submission is a choice, and that there is always another choice. The treaty was signed. The Keth withdrew, and across the galaxy, the whispers grew louder. 50 years after first contact, humanity received a message from the Concord of 12. It was not a demand. It was not a threat. It was an invitation. The Concord wanted to discuss human membership. Director Lin Chun, granddaughter of Maya Chun, who had sent the first refusal, read the message carefully. She had grown up on stories of Karath Prime. She had served as an ambassador during the Keth War. She understood better than anyone what this invitation meant. The Concord was afraid, not of human military power. Humanity was still small, still outmatched by the great empires. But the Concord had watched what happened when the Keth tried to crush humanity. They had seen the doctrine of strategic perseverance in action, and they had watched the effects spread through their own territory. In the 50 years since first contact, 17 tributary species had filed formal petitions for increased autonomy. 4 had staged small rebellions. 1 had successfully negotiated limited self-governance. None of them mentioned humanity directly. They did not need to. Everyone knew where the idea had come from. The doctrine of inevitable submission was cracking, and the Concord's leaders understood that cracks, left unattended, became breaks. So they made a calculated decision. Better to bring the humans inside, where they could be managed, than to leave them outside, spreading dangerous ideas. Director Chun traveled to the Concord's capital world. The journey took 3 weeks. She spent that time preparing, reviewing files, and studying the weaknesses her people had spent 50 years cataloging. The council chamber was vast and ancient. 12 seats for 12 founding species, arranged in a circle. Around them, galleries held representatives from hundreds of tributary worlds. All of them watched as the human ambassador entered. The eldest council member, a being called Sorth, who had lived for 900 years, spoke the formal words of invitation. The Concord recognized humanity's achievements. They admired human resilience. They wished to offer full membership with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. Chun listened politely. Then she rose to respond. "We accept," she said. "And we have conditions." The chamber went silent. In 6,000 years, no species had ever responded to a membership offer with conditions. They accepted gratefully, or they refused and were eventually conquered. There was no third option. Until now. Chun continued speaking. Her voice was calm, but it filled the chamber. "We have spent 50 years studying your Concord. We know your strengths. We also know your weaknesses. We know about the tributary species who accepted submission because they saw no choice. We know about the populations on 100 worlds who serve you because resistance seemed impossible." She paused. "Our condition is this: reformation. Gradual, diplomatic, working within your own systems, but moving toward a Concord where membership is voluntary, where tributary species have real paths to autonomy, where the doctrine of submission is replaced with something better. Sorath leaned forward. 900 years of experience showed in his eyes. And what would you call this better doctrine? We call it earned cooperation. You don't rule because you can't destroy those who resist. You lead because others choose to follow. The difference matters. A murmur ran through the galleries. Representatives of tributary species were listening. Their attention was sharp. Hungry. Another council member spoke. And if we decline these conditions? Chun had prepared for this question. She answered without hesitation. Then we withdraw our acceptance. We return to human space. And we continue what we've been doing for 50 years. Which is? Building coalitions. Sharing our story. Supporting every species that has ever questioned whether submission is the only path. Not through war, we've all seen where that leads, but through persistence. She looked around the chamber, meeting eyes, holding gazes. You've learned something about us since Karath Prime. We don't quit. You can't beat us because we don't recognize defeat. You can't exhaust us because we've built our entire culture around endurance. And you can't ignore us because we will never, ever stop. She let the words settle. This isn't a threat. It's simply who we are. And you can either have us inside your Concord, working for change within your systems, or you can have us outside, working for the same change against your systems. Either way, the change is coming. The debate lasted 3 days. Council members argued about precedent, about stability, about the risks of reform. But underneath all the arguments lay a simple calculation. The humans had demonstrated over 50 years that they could not be conquered in a meaningful sense. The cost of trying would be higher than the cost of compromise. On the third day, the vote was taken. It passed by the narrowest margin in Concord. History. Chun signed the membership documents in a ceremony that was broadcast across the galaxy. But the real moment came afterward, in a private meeting with Sorath. You realize, the ancient being said, that what you're proposing will take centuries to achieve. You won't live to see it completed. Chun nodded. We know. That's the point. I don't understand. You've lived 900 years. You think in terms of your own lifetime. We live maybe 80 years, if we're lucky. We learned long ago that the important work is always bigger than any one life. We pass it on, generation to generation. We build things we won't see finished. She paused. That's why you couldn't beat us at Karath Prime. Colonel Okonkwo knew he might die in those tunnels. His daughter knew she might die flying supplies through your fleet. They weren't fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the people who came after. That's what we do. That's who we are. Sorath was quiet for a long moment. Perhaps, he said finally, we have been thinking about resistance incorrectly. Perhaps, Chun agreed. But now you have the chance to think about cooperation instead. In the years that followed, the galaxy changed. Slowly, painfully, with setbacks and frustrations and small victories that accumulated over time. Tributary species gained rights. Autonomy expanded. The Concord evolved from an empire into something closer to a federation. The humans never stopped pushing. Generations passed. The names of Chun and Okonkwo became history. But the work continued, passed from hand to hand, mind to mind, heart to heart, and across the galaxy. Species that had once bowed to inevitable submission learned a different lesson. They learned that endurance mattered. That stubbornness was its own kind of strength. That the long game, played with patience and determination, could achieve what no army ever could. They learned why humans never quit. 100 years after first contact, a historian named Kalen Sorath Chun presented his research to a packed assembly hall on the Concord's capital world. He was an unusual being. His father's line traced back to the ancient Sorath, who had first debated with humanity. His mother's line traced back to director Lin Chun. In him, the two legacies had merged. The topic of his presentation was simple. How had humanity, a small species barely a century into faster-than-light travel, reshaped a 6,000-year-old galactic civilization? He began with numbers. When humanity first received the Concorde's tributary demand, they controlled 12 colony worlds. Their military was adequate for pirates and minor disputes. Their economy was a rounding error in galactic terms. The Concorde, by contrast, commanded 400 systems. Their military had never lost a war of conquest. Their economy had crushed competitors for millennia. By every objective measure, humanity should have been absorbed. The mathematics were absolute. And yet, Kalen said, I stand before you today as evidence that mathematics is not everything. He showed them the records from Karath Prime, not the military reports. Those had been studied endlessly, but the personal accounts. The messages Colonel Okonkwo had sent during the siege. The diary entries of miners who had become soldiers. The recordings of children singing in the tunnels. The Concorde expected the humans to break, Kalen explained. Every model predicted it. Every historical precedent demanded it. But the models and precedents were missing something crucial. He paused. They were missing the why. The humans at Karath Prime had not fought because they thought they could win. They had fought because surrender meant giving up something they valued more than survival. They called it freedom. They called it dignity. They called it the right to choose their own path. These were not military concepts. They could not be measured or quantified. And so the Concorde's analysts had missed them entirely. Kalen moved to the second part of his presentation, the 20 years between the Treaty of Karath and the Keth War. The Concorde believed they had contained the human problem, he said. They were wrong. The humans used those 20 years to build something far more dangerous than a military. They had built a culture. The children of Karath Prime grew up with a specific understanding of the universe. They learned that power could be resisted. They learned that endurance was a weapon. They learned that the long game, played with patience, could achieve what force alone could not. This understanding spread. It influenced how humans designed their ships, their institutions, their relationships with other species. It became the foundation of strategic perseverance, not just a military doctrine, but a way of being in the world. By the time the Keth attacked, Kalen said, they were not facing a small species that had gotten lucky once. They were facing a civilization built around the principle of never giving up. The Keth War had demonstrated this principle in action. The humans lost every major battle. They were pushed back, defeated, humiliated, and they kept fighting. More importantly, they kept talking. Kalen showed examples of the broadcasts humanity had sent during the war. Not propaganda. They were too honest for propaganda. Just stories. The story of Karath Prime. The story of Colonel Okonkwo and his daughter. The stories of ordinary people who had chosen resistance over submission. These stories spread through the Keth territory. They spread through the Concorde's territory. They planted seeds that would take decades to bloom. The humans understood something that empires often forget, Kalen said. Ideas are more powerful than armies. An army can be defeated. An idea can only be replaced by a better idea. He moved to the final part of his presentation, the transformation of the Concorde itself. Director Lin Chun's conditions had seemed impossible at the time. A gradual reformation of a 6,000-year-old empire. A shift from submission to cooperation. A recognition that power earned was stronger than power taken. Many thought she was naive, Kalen said. They pointed to the scale of what she was proposing. The centuries it would take. The resistance from those who benefited from the old system. He smiled. They forgot who they were dealing with. The humans had not expected quick results. They had prepared for generations of work. They built institutions designed to outlast individuals. They trained diplomats who would train other diplomats who would train still others. They created systems that could maintain momentum across centuries. And they found allies. The tributary species of the Concord had lived under submission for thousands of years. Many had accepted their status as natural, inevitable, correct. But some had never quite believed it. Some had carried quiet doubts, passed from generation to generation, waiting for something they could not name. The humans gave them something to believe in. The Reformation succeeded, Kalen said, not because humanity was powerful, but because humanity showed others that change was possible. They demonstrated, through their own example, that the old order was not the only order. He looked around the assembly hall. The audience included representatives from species that had once been tributary, species that now had full membership, full rights, full dignity, species whose ancestors had watched the siege of Karath Prime and wondered, for the first time, if they too might dare to say no. My father's line goes back to the rulers of this Concord, Kalen said. My mother's line goes back to the humans who defied it. I am the product of that joining, and I am not unique. Across this galaxy, the boundaries that once seemed fixed have become flexible. The hierarchies that once seemed eternal have evolved. He paused. This is the human legacy. Not conquest. Not domination. Not the imposition of their will on others. Simply this. They showed us that we have choices. That submission is not inevitable. That the long game, played with patience and persistence, can reshape the stars. The presentation ended. The audience rose in acknowledgement, not applause exactly, but something deeper. A recognition of truth. Afterward, Kalen stood alone in the empty hall. Through the windows, he could see the capital city stretching to the horizon. Ships rose and fell, carrying beings from 1,000 worlds. All of them living in a galaxy that had been transformed by a species too stubborn to surrender. His communicator chimed. A message from a research colleague asking about his next project. Kalen thought about it. There were so many stories still to tell. So many aspects of the human influence still to explore. The work would take lifetimes. It would never truly be finished. That, he realized, was exactly the point. He typed his response. I'm just getting started. The message went out across the stars. And somewhere, in the vast archive that held humanity's recorded history, the words of Colonel Okonkwo played on eternal repeat. We are still here. We are still holding. 100 years later, across a galaxy that had learned to stand rather than kneel, those words remained true.